Hey everyone, welcome back to another video from the Man Talks NRL Supercoach, and in today's video, finally going to be going through my team selection for the first round of the season. Let's get into it. So after much hair pulling, a lot of tinkering, we've finally been able to get to a team that I think I'm pretty happy with. If the lockout was, in 5 minutes from now, I don't think I'd be making any changes to the side. So that's the kind of positive way I'm going to be thinking about my team. And so hopefully you guys will take some use out of the kind of, reasoning behind why I've chosen certain players. Start off looking at the forwards. So I've gone with the cheap hooker route that I've mentioned in my previous team build video. I think Connor Watson being named at number 13 offers really great value, and I think he's going to be a safe pick to have at my starting hooker position. And with Jacob Liddle, I think at 247k, with no Jake Simpkin on the bench, even though there is question marks given that Moses Mbye might potentially at number 14 take some of his minutes from round 2 and potentially even in round 1, with Tommy Talau taking up the 5'8 spot in round 1 and Mbye giving Liddle a spell playing at hooker. I still think Liddle is still a relatively safe bet, and I think he's obviously, without Simpkin on the bench at all, I think the Tigers obviously think that Liddle is going to be their primary hooker, and so I could expect somewhere even between, say, 50 to 60 minutes potentially with him. And so I think he'll be a good cash cow option to begin the year. So I'm very comfortable having those two being my starting hookers. Obviously, I would like having people like Damien Cook or Coruscant, or even in the mid-range category with Jaden Brayley or Josh Hodgson, definitely were considerations. But with what I wanted to do with the rest of my team, I thought this was a good approach for me. So that's why I've gone with these two relatively cheap hookers. Moving on to the front row forward, I'm really happy with the kind of two front row forwards that I've been able to get. Taukei'aho, who I think will be maybe in the top 3 front row forwards for the whole season, given that he already was coming off a good season last year, averaging around 63 points from about 57 minutes of game time. Given that added responsibility of the goal kicking, I can already see his average bumping up by another 5 to 10 minutes, and I don't really see any reason why his minutes would decrease. If anything, they may potentially increase, with Waerea-Hargreaves taking maybe slightly of a lesser role with the Roosters forwards. So I think Taukei'aho, yes, he's pretty expensive at 560k, but I think I'm very comfortable having him to start my season, and I think he'll be a great gun front row forward option, one I'm very happy to have. And next I've got Christian Welch, who at 450k is going to be that really popular kind of mid-range front row option. I think I'm really happy, and I think given with the the injuries with Dale Finucane, which is going to put him out for at least the first 6 weeks of the season, I think Christian Welch is going to be a big beneficiary of that. I think he's going to be playing a lot of extra minutes, probably maybe averaging around the 55 mark. So I could see him point scoring maybe in around the 60 point mark. And so as a result, I think Christian Welch is then going to be a really good value option in front row. And so I'm very happy to have him in my team as well. And on the bench, just gone with Spencer Leniu and Stefano Uitoikamanu, two very popular kind of cheap front row options. I think these guys, I'm not really going to rely on them too much in terms of cash cow generation, given that they both are named on the bench. But given how cheap they are, I think there's still going to be some money made from them. I just don't think it's going to be like very quick, large amounts of money. I think it will be a bit of a slow burn with these two, but when we're starting the season, obviously we have to kind of keep the money tight in certain areas, and so I think I'm happy with having these two be my reserve front row forwards. Next up, we've got our second row forward. I think Angus Crichton and Ryan Matterson, I don't really have to talk about too much. I think they are the standout second row forward options to have this season. I think they're both going to be really super consistent, constantly, I think, getting towards that 75-80 point mark during the season, and so I think automatically they become set and forget kind of second row options. I don't really want to think about them too much. I had locked them into my team very early on, and they haven't gone in any of my tinkering, so don't think they're going to be going anywhere. And obviously I would highly recommend the two. They are very expensive, but they're worth the money in my opinion, so very happy to have those two. And then the third second row forward spot, I've got Tino Fa'asuamaleaui. I think he's going to be a really good kind of third second row forward option for me. He's only priced about 500k. He does have the dual flexibility at front row forward and second row forward. And in the previous video I mentioned, I think he's going to have a really impactful role at the Titans, more so than what he had at the Storm. I think we saw a little taste of what he can produce in the trial match at the Warriors when he had that run and scored a try. I think while yes, his numbers probably were inflated from attacking stats last season, I think he does have that in his game and he has the potential to get them. And so I don't think it's going to be too much of a risk to go without him. He is very heavily owned as well. Not that I'm choosing him because I'm afraid I don't want to miss on the party. I do genuinely think he is a good option. And so I expect him to be in a lot of teams. And I think I'm very happy to have him as well as my third second row. The bench for the second row, I'm not super keen on, to be honest. Like Jordan Ricci, I think is obviously going to be a lock in a lot of teams, given that he's now named in the starting second row for the Broncos. But the other two, I've gone with enough in Ben Trbojevic purely because for the money, and he's going to be the only enough that I've got in my starting 25. And he's listed in both second row and center, which I think down the line can come in handy, having that dual flexibility when I'm trying to maybe tinker with my squad during the season. And I've got Terrell Fuimiono, priced about 260k. Honestly, he's not someone I really had considered before Teamless Tuesday, but given that he was a kind of surprise selection at number 13 with the Dragons, I thought potentially I think there is going to be some risk with him. We just don't know if he's going to hold that spot long term. That selection could explode in my face for all I know, given that I thought he typically was playing like more of an edge or a center role. So it really was odd to see him in the middle. So I don't know if that's the new coach, maybe just want to try a few different forward rotations. But purely for the money, I think I had to just go with him. If obviously he kind of pans out that it's not a good option in the next couple of weeks, I can maybe hopefully downgrade him to maybe another cheaper option, so like say a Ryan James, if Ryan James actually ends up having a decent amount of minutes. The reason I haven't gone with James is because I think given the forward depth at the Raiders plus the return of the two Corys to the Raiders outfit once they come back from their suspension, I feel like Ryan James is going to be the one who gets pushed out as a result, which is why I haven't gone with him. At least Fuimiono I know is named and is starting at number 13, so I can hopefully hope for some good minutes. I'm not going to be playing him in my 17, but hopefully he can make some money to begin the season. And moving on to the backs, Nathan Cleary, set and forget halfback option. I think I made it plainly obvious in my halfback video that he is the standout halfback option, and so he's an absolute must for me, and he's not going anywhere. Reserve halfback spot was interesting. I have been kind of struggling between whether I want to be getting like a backup halfback or if I just want to go the really cheap route and just go with like Sam Walker from the Roosters, who's at 173k. I've landed on going for a backup half. I think it does help in that if potentially Cleary does go down with injury, we don't have to use a trade to trade him to another halfback. We do have someone who can fill in for him. And the two options who I was considering in that kind of 400k mark were Jamal Fogarty and Chanel Harris-Tavita. I was on Harris-Tavita for a long time, but just looking at the numbers and the draw for the two sides respectively, I think I've been leaning a bit more towards Fogarty. Harris-Tavita does have dual flexibility, which I think does come in handy during at different points in the season. And I do think Harris-Tavita actually probably has got a lot more upside in him than, say, Fogarty. We haven't really seen Harris-Tavita in the trials, and that does put me off a little bit. And it's actually just come out today that given that he's returning from his quadriceps injury, Cody Nikorima is actually going to be taking the goal-kicking duties at least in round 1 for the Warriors. So, potentially, obviously, I would expect Harris-Tavita to take the goal-kicking duties back when he's ready to do so. But you never know, potentially Nikorima could be kicking really, really accurately and they decide, he could just be the goal kicker. And that was one of the appeals of Harris-Tavita, in my opinion, was his goal kicking benefit. But at least for round 1, he doesn't have that. And I think overall, looking at the first 6 games, I decided that the Titans, I think, have a much better draw overall compared to the Warriors. And I think Fogarty is also going to have the goal kicking duties. And so at similar price, I was happy to go with him. I think the Titans overall, I would expect to perform slightly better than, say, the Warriors. And I think, if you expect to be scoring more tries with the likes of Fafita and Tino, with Fogarty getting more points from goal kicking, I think that does make him a little bit undervalued. And so I think he'll be a good kind of mid-range halfback option who you can sit behind Nathan Cleary. At 5'8", I've kind of deviated away from the the kings of the 5'8" in terms of Cody Walker and Munster. I've actually gone for Dylan Brown, a bit of a pod option. I was really kind of, for money's sake, I was really tossing up between, say, him and Jerome Luai. I think Jerome Luai is going to be a really, really popular option to begin the season, given the Panthers' really good early draw and the kind of form that they already showed in that trial match against the Eels. I think he himself looked really good. And so I wouldn't argue with anyone in terms of picking Luai over Dylan Brown. The reason I've gone with Dylan Brown, though, is I think I just feel a bit more comfortable given that he's got a little bit of a higher base than Luai. And I think the Eels do have a good kind of overall draw in the first 6 to 8 rounds. They do have a tough game against the Storm in round 2, but their first game is against the Broncos, and I think that's a really good matchup for the Eels. I think the Eels themselves are a very settled side in terms of their 1 to 17. Not many changes from the previous season. There is potentially a question mark over the switch of Dylan Brown, I think, moving from, say, the left side of the attack to the right side. I think that's all due to, I think, the coach wanting to kind of reinvigorate that Eels attack, because that really did peter out at the back end of last season. But I think Dylan Brown, is coming into another year and he showed so much promise already in his rookie season. I think he's a really strong runner of the ball. and I think given the new rules, I think that might suit his kind of game style. So I'm quite happy to have him as a bit of a pod option. I'm hoping that kind of high base that he's got, compounded with potentially a good amount of attacking stats, will give him some good value to begin the season. And for the money, and not even for the money, I think Cody Walker and Munster obviously I think will be the two best 5/8 options. I was just looking at their kind of draw, and I just don't know how good the early draw is for both the Souths and the Storm, whereas the Eels I prefer, Panthers I prefer. So I was kind of happy to step down at the 5/8 position and go into what I would say is the next tier below Walker and Munster, would say like Dylan Brown or Luai, who I was also considering as well. But overall, I'm pretty happy with Dylan Brown. Bit of a pod option for me. It's not all about having pods, but I think it is nice, and I think he's going to be a good pod who should hopefully score well for me. And in my backup 5/8 spot, I've got Lachlan Lamb, who I've kind of touched on previously as well. We've only got a small sample size from him, but in the games that he did play 80 minutes with the Roosters, he had a really, really high base stat output, and I think he looked really good in the trials. He should have hopefully a good combination with Angus Crichton on the left side of the Roosters attack, and I think that would probably be their maybe strongest side of the attack, given that they've got the likes of, say, Daniel Tupou, Angus Crichton. Teddy will obviously chip in there as well. So I think Lachlan Lamb is hopefully going to benefit with some attacking stats to go along with, I think, a pretty good base floor. So I'm very happy to have him as well. Obviously, other considerations I had in this position were like Matt Moylan or Tex Hoy. Tex Hoy, I kind of have flagged the risk that he's more of a short-term option, given that he's kind of a placeholder until Kalyn Ponga comes back. And apparently he doesn't even have the goal kicking anymore. Mitch Barnett is apparently touted to get the goal kicking duties at the Knights while Ponga's out of the side, and so that already then does limit the appeal of Tex Hoy, so for that reason I wasn't too keen on him. Moylan I think is obviously going to be a really popular backup 5/8 option. The reason I didn't go for him was twofold. One, I just don't think the Sharks early draw is very kind, and so I think someone like Moylan, who would probably be getting more points from his attacking stats, I don't actually know how many attacking stats the Sharks are going to get in their tough games, and two, it's his injury history. So I think those two reasons for me alone, I was happy to spend a little extra like 50-60k to get to Lachlan Lamb, who I think overall is going to be playing in a much better side. I think he's got better base stats, and so I think for that reason I was happy with Lachlan Lamb as my backup 5/8. Moving into the centres, again, I haven't gone super cheap in the centres, but there are a lot of cheap cash cow options, given that this is where most of the value is going to be, and I think in a lot of teams. Originally I did have Brian To'o in my centre wing position, given that I think he's probably going to be a very, very high performing centre this season, potentially in the top 4 or 5, given the Panthers' early draw and his good base work rate. Given what I wanted to do with the rest of the side, I've actually decided to downgrade To'o to Kurt Capewell. So Capewell was named in the starting number 12 role at the Panthers ahead of Liam Martin, and I did mention in my earlier team video that we don't quite know what his minutes are going to be, but I've had to think about it a little bit more, and I'd expect if Liam Martin does come into the Panthers side and plays in the middle, I think Capewell, who plays on an edge, actually might even get 80 minutes potentially. And I think in the 2 games he played 80 minutes, in the few games he played at 80 minutes last season, he was getting a base of about 55. So I think having a second row forward player in real life playing in your centres in Supercoach, I think really does come in handy, similar to what we had with Isaiah Yeo last season. Obviously the benefit of Isaiah Yeo last season was that he does play at the lock position, and he was playing like 80 minutes. The minutes we just don't quite know with Capewell, but at 420k I think he's a pretty decent option to have in the centre, just to have a little bit more security, because the centre scoring can be very volatile when you're going with all cheap centres. So Capewell, I think, is very happy to have him. If he can give me like 55 to 60 points a game, would be very happy with that, and then he should hopefully go up in value as well. And the reason I've got him and then say Ben Trbojevic as well in my reserve second row is that they've both got that second row forward centre flexibility. So I think having him and Ben Trbojevic, who also has that same flexibility, does help if I ever want to flick between the two when I'm doing trades later on in the season. The other centres here I'm not going to really touch on too much. I think they're all very common cheap centres who there's been a lot of discussion around, so I don't think I need to really go into them too much. I guess a notable omission would be kind of James Roberts. He's a little bit more expensive than a lot of these guys. He's around 270k. The reason I haven't gone for him was mainly the money. I just couldn't really make the money work with what I wanted to do with the rest of the team. But I think even with the Tigers, they've got a pretty tough start to the season, and I've already got Dane Laurie, so I wasn't quite comfortable having so many, of the Tigers backline in my starting team. Obviously, if he does really well, I'll have to reconsider and see how I can maybe get him into the team before he rises up in price. Potentially that might even mean if, say, Charlie Staines, doesn't do too well over the first 2 games, maybe flicking Charlie Saints for James Roberts. I do have about 15k left in the bank with this current team build, so it could even mean, going from someone like, say, Fusatua to Roberts, and combined with another trade, that might be able to get me there as well. But yeah, very cheap centre aside from Kurt Capewell, which I think I'm pretty comfortable with. I think having Capewell would add a little bit of security to the centre scoring. And finally in the fullbacks, I don't think I really need to talk about these two that much either. Dame Tedesco and Ryan Papenhuyzen. I think they're going to be kind of like the 1 and the 2 most popular fullback options to begin the season. Tedesco, I don't really have to talk about him too much. Obviously, you guys probably already know I love the guy so much, and I think he's going to be set and forget captain option during the whole season. And I think I'm not comfortable to kind of wait for and hope that his price might go down to begin the season. I'm going to get him into my team to begin the year, and then I'll feel a lot better about my side in general. And then in the second fullback spot, Ryan Papenhuyzen, pretty happy with him. I think the Storm do have tough games to begin the year, but it's the Storm, Obviously there are concerns given that they don't have Harry Grant anymore, who would have been one of their chief creative players, but I have faith in the Storm to still perform well. And he does have that added bonus of goal kicking now, which, already I can see that adding maybe 8 to 10 points a game to his average. So I think even though he is pretty pricey as well at 630k, I think he's going to be a very, very solid option. The only other players I really considered in that position was, say, Brimson or Gutherson. I think both of them two both have really good draws to begin the season. Brimson is a little bit more expensive than Papenhuyzen, and I think given that Papenhuyzen has that goal kicking, it was hard to kind of justify Brimson over Papenhuyzen. Gutherson I could see a good argument for as well. He does actually have a very good record against the Broncos, who he opens up with. I'm pretty sure he scored over 100 points both times last season when he played the Broncos. So, if you want to really start your season off with a flyer, you can maybe pick Gutho if you want to, instead of, say, Papenhuyzen. I think Papenhuyzen is someone I'm going to be wanting to get into my team anyway, so I think just trying to save the trade and just get him to my team to start the season, I think I feel a lot better about that. But yeah, overall, that's my team, guys. I've got about 13k left in the bank with this squad. I'm pretty happy with it. I think one of my priorities was, aside from, say, the hooker, was to try to get at least one kind of good mid-range / gun option in every position, just so that if price changes do kind of occur as, maybe how I don't expect, it gives me some flexibility to say I have got someone of a good price point in that position who I can, say, downgrade to a cheaper option if they're expecting to go up in price. So I think I'm pretty happy with that kind of structure. Obviously, there are going to be some notable omissions, say, like there's no Munster, there's no Cody Walker, who are both very well owned. There's no Dave Fafita, who's a very popular second row option. Obviously no Damien Cook, no Coruscant. But I think it's very easy to look at your team and see what you don't have. I think what's really important is to focus on what you do have, and that will help you also just kind of be more confident in your selections and overall. I've kind of tried to take that approach because I've been tinkering with my side way too much, and I stopped and looked at this and thought, I'm pretty happy overall with the kind of balance of this team. I don't think there's any one position which is I've put too much emphasis, say, in. Maybe the front row, you could argue, but I think I'm pretty comfortable with that. So I think the balance overall I'm pretty happy with, and so I don't really see myself making too many changes, hopefully, come lockout. I mean, famous last words for all we know. If I were to change anything potentially before lockout, it might be Dylan Brown to Luai, it might be Fogarty to Harris Tavita, but I've kind of given some reasons as to why I've gone with these guys in particular anyway, and so hopefully I'll stick with my reasoning. But aside from that, I don't really see too much changing with this team. So I actually wanted to quickly throw this up as well. This was actually a team that is made of players who are the most commonly owned currently in Supercoach. I thought it was actually really interesting to look at, just to kind of, for myself, to even benchmark, well, not necessarily benchmark, but just compare how my team is stacked up against what, the wider population of Supercoach players think is what they think are the best options, basically. And so the cheap hooker route does definitely look to be the most popular way that coaches are going with Watson and Little. They were the two most popular hooker options. Damien Cook was a shade below them as well, I think only by about a couple of percentage points. So I think come lockout, obviously he could get in there. But just looking at that initial trend, it does look like the cheap hooker route is what players are going for. In terms of the front row reserves, exact same. Spencer Leniu and Oichi Kamanu. Not surprised to see Tino. Josh Papali, I'm actually quite surprised to see, though, in that front row. 560k, I feel like, for myself, I think Takiaho is a lot better of an option, given that, yes, Papali is very important to how the Raiders play, and he does have that upside of, he just goes on a run sometimes of scoring like 2-3 tries in a row, and that really does give him that high ceiling of scoring 100 plus. But I think overall for consistency, I would myself would prefer Takiaho. I think Papali does have that disadvantage of the Raiders to have a lot of good quality forwards, so I think it's very easy to kind of justify giving Papali rest at certain times during a game, especially also when it gets towards the end of the season, although that is a long time away. But yeah, Papali I was a little bit surprised to see. Like, I would prefer kind of Taukei'aho myself, but I do understand the reasoning. He does have a very high upside, so I can't really fault too many people for going for him, but just not the direction that I'm going. Second row, very similar to mine as well. I think Crichton and Madison, not surprised at all to see. They are absolute locks. The lack of Taumalolo is actually quite interesting, and I think that does show that a lot of Supercoaches are put off by that talk about his minutes being reduced, and just how his role is going to be different at the Cowboys this season compared to previous seasons. So that is a notable absentee who I didn't actually mention in my squad. I'm not running with Taumalolo. Dave Fifita, who I don't have, he is a very popular second row forward option. I think he does have similar upside to, say, like Tino, given that he does have that attacking threat. He has got massive upside. He can easily score 100 plus, and the Titans do have an early draw, so he could definitely be a good beneficiary of that early start to the season. So yeah, it is a bit fearful of me to not go with Fifita, but I'm pretty comfortable with how my squad's structured, that hopefully, I'm not going to be hurt too much by him doing well. In terms of the bench, very similar to mine in the second row. Jordan Ricky, absolute set and forget. Ben Trbojevic, I think, is going to be a very popular kind of basement dollar enough option that players are going to use just to kind of balance overall team structure and to give themselves some more money. Ryan James, I think the reason he's probably popular is that he was named in the 17, and he is cheaper than, say, the likes of Fuimeono, who I had in my team. I think the risk of Ryan James is that when the two Corys come back to the Raiders, he might drop out of that side altogether. And even if he does play at the 17, he might not even get that many minutes, in my opinion. So I actually don't know how much cash generation potential he has anyway. But I can understand why he's so popular. In the halves, not too many surprises that Nathan Cleary is the most popular halfback. Don't really have to talk about him. Sam Walker actually being the second most popular halfback is quite interesting. I think it shows that a lot of players are looking at not really going with a backup half and are just thinking about going real cheap in that reserve spot to then, use that money elsewhere in their side. Say, for example, in my team, I've got Fogarty, but as a result of having Fogarty, I can't really upgrade my 5'8" to anything higher. Whereas with this approach, you can go from Sam Walker to Cam Munster, who is the most popular 5'8" option, alongside Moylan as the backup as the backup 5'8". Munster, I think I'm kind of going a little bit against the grain by not going with him. I can completely understand why he's the most popular. He's probably going to be one of the highest averaging 5'8" this season. For me, it's just like, with how I wanted to balance my team, it was just really difficult to get him in. He was in my very first kind of draft team, but as I've kind of tinkered my side a little bit more, I found it was a bit hard to fit him into my team without sacrificing really in areas that I didn't really want to. So that's the reason I haven't gone for Munster. The Storm do have a tough start to the season, so potentially, he might go down in price, but I don't really like using that argument with these kind of players who can go massive in any game, regardless of opposition. So yeah, I'm a little bit fearful of Munster, given that he is so highly owned, but I'm hoping that it pays off and that he has maybe a bit of a slower start to the season. Matt Moylan, again, I can't really fault the popularity of him. He is cheaper than Lachlan Lamb, who I've got in my backup 5'8" spot, but I've given my reasons as to why I'm not going Moylan. There's a little bit of risk there in my opinion, but I think given that he does provide that kind of 50 to 60,000 saving compared to Lachlan Lamb, I can see why he's so popular. What is interesting about the centres is actually, I think it seems most players are going for real cheap in the centres. So, they're going for the usual names like Staines, Tessinu, Laurie, Simonson, Roberts, Saab, and Suwali, actually. A bit of a popular kind of nuff, basement dollar option that people are going for. I think that does actually show that if you do have guys like, say, Capewell, or even if you want to extend to guys like Brian Kelly, Brian To'o, I think that does put you at a little bit of an advantage and in a bit of a pod territory, given that it seems the majority of players are going to go real cheap in the centres. So that is something to consider maybe when you're building your side. If you do feel like you want to have a little bit extra money in the centres, you could go with players like that. Even players like Averillo, Ramus Smith, who I think are going to be good mid-range options, or even Blake Ferguson. So I think that is potentially something to keep in the back of your mind when building your team before the lockout tomorrow. Maybe it is worth paying a little bit more in one of your centre positions if you are trying to maybe separate from what the majority of people are going to do. I've kind of done that to an extent by getting in Kurt Capewell. And of those centres there, I don't have James Roberts, given that he was a little bit more expensive compared to the rest of those cheap centres. And I don't really love the Tigers' start to the season. Fullbacks, as I said, I completely expect these two to be the most popular fullbacks, exact to what I've got as well. So yeah, no surprises that these are the most two popular. I'm not going to go through the reasonings as to why they're the most popular. I've kind of done that already. So yeah, not surprised to see Tedesco and Pappenhausen as the two most popular fullbacks to begin the season. Well, that's it guys, we made it to the end of the video. Hopefully me going through my team and also the most commonly owned players hopefully gave you some ideas as to maybe how you want to build your squad to begin the season, and hopefully that guys gave you some ideas as to the kind of thought process that I've gone into how I've selected the players in certain positions. So hopefully you guys found some value out of that. If you did like the video, would really appreciate a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing, as I'll be continuing to putting out videos throughout the NRL Supercoach season. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.